It has been a while, but it's time to check back in with our friend Ryan Blue Bowen, the abominable, the indomitable, the phenomenal primal demiurge rising from the Isle of Convictions. But why exactly are we checking in on him? Well, it's because we need content. Previously, we talked about his claims of using only HCG under a doctor's recommendation to regain fertility, which was more than likely damaged by previous anabolic steroid use. HCG, as we've said, can sometimes be prescribed as a hormone replacement therapy, but more often than not, people simply use testosterone directly. So the big question is whether or not Ryan is using testosterone or any other drugs alongside the supposed HCG. To be honest, I would be very surprised if he is not using something, even if just a TRT-style dose of testosterone. As we know, he has a history of use and abuse of these drugs, so it's not as if he's entirely opposed to using them, and we have seen his size, weight, and strength increase quite rapidly over the past few months. He lives in Australia, which is quite notorious for having a steroid-abusing community, and trains under the guidance of Lachlan Adair, who I'm sure more than a few people suspect may be involved with some drug use, perhaps. And to top it off, he competes in a sport which is largely untested and exists in the modern social media heavy age, where gym strength and visuals are much more valuable than actual performance. In the modern age, it becomes more and more difficult to justify not using something when your daily income benefits from using it. But regardless of guesses and estimations based on questionably reliable sources, we can see at least that it seems Ryan has now adopted a much more traditional and basic system of training, which would be beneficial to almost anybody regardless of whether or not they use X, Y, or Z chemical assistance. He is now training the bench press, squat, rows, and some other very basic compound movements that don't directly seem to mimic the specific movements within the sport he competes in, but by strengthening the body in certain areas, which are also the areas and body used in that sport, he obtains a stronger platform for which to improve within the sport itself. It's basically the same in every sport that depends on the human body being strong alongside the technical movements of the sport itself. Having a strong body is good, but that without any technical abilities is only going to get you beyond athletes without technical abilities. Having good technical abilities is good too, and will most likely get you much further in the sport than just being strong. But when you come up against people who have good technical abilities and are very strong, you can't compete. Of course, this doesn't mean you have to be maxing out in the squat, bench, and deadlift. That itself is an entirely different sport, and pursuing those excessively will bring diminishing returns to the sport you aim to improve at. Instead, a better framework is to think of the sport itself as the peak of a pyramid. In terms of arm wrestling, that is actual competition-style matches on a table. That is the pinnacle and the ultimate goal. Below that is practice of the competition style, or sparring, which can take many forms, but always aims towards the end goal. And below that you have the less specific general training. Inside this you have a range of styles of training, which could include very similar seeming movements like training on the table but with non-human opponents, like cable system to simulate an opponent, or this could be movements that seem ultra specific to the sport, like training rising with tiny movements that are essentially isometric, or this could be partially specific movements like hammer curls but with a strap over the knuckles to train rising in a more dynamic way. Or these could be movements that don't seem at all specific to arm wrestling, like the bench press, deadlift, and squat, but ideally these exercises still train muscles that are in some way useful for the sport at the top of the pyramid. While no, it is not entirely necessary to train any of these bottom row exercises, but if you pursue the methods of ultra sport specific training only, you become less able to isolate specific areas and methodically work on them. You can improve your back pressure strength by practicing it on the table, absolutely, but what if the wrist is strong and the elbow is weak, or vice versa? You could attempt to manipulate how you use back pressure in training, but how do you track progress? How do you accurately adjust how much resistance the opponent is giving at any given time? What if the opponent you train with gets injured and you have to train with a new one? Or worse, you don't have a backup option. All of these variables are main reasons why simple resistance training can be very beneficial for a more systematic and methodical approach to improving strength for the table. Of course, ideally you should still practice on the table to put those raw basic strength gains into specific practice, and that is exactly what table training should be treated as for most of the time. practice. The vast majority of a sprinter's training cycles is not going to be attempting to break world records at home. It's going to be identifying and addressing specific components that eventually work together to improve his end goal of running faster. So what are the components to this? Well, he has to be fast to run fast, but what is fast? How is speed produced in humans running? Speed is produced by the body outputting force into the ground over and over, rapidly, and with very rapid application of force, also known as power. If the amount of force they can put into the ground increases, the speed almost always does too, assuming the power ability remains at least the same and the mass of the athlete isn't increasing excessively. And how is power trained? By taking the basic muscle strength and learning to exert it very quickly, which can be done with the sport itself, since sprinting inherently depends on being powerful, or by training other exercises in a power development style. And power depends on raw muscle strength, also known as force. So how is force trained? Well, simply by making the muscles and tendons responsible more capable of exerting more force, which means just making them stronger. So you see how, if we just replace the sport with arm wrestling, the method remains the same. How do you improve at the sport? By increasing all of the requisite components. How do you move faster in arm wrestling? By training specifically to move faster. How do you become more powerful in that speed? By being stronger and training to output that strength quickly. And how do you become stronger in arm wrestling? By just making the involved muscles stronger in themselves, and then converting that strength into something more specific. This is basically the modern format for improving in all physically demanding sports. You can, of course, achieve this same effect by creating obscure exercises that hit the intended muscles and seem to be more effective or beneficial because they look slightly more similar to the sport itself. But the muscles do not know how or why they are being stressed, only that they are being stressed. So why overcomplicate and create exercises that offer nothing extra and more often than not do not target multiple muscle groups as well as those basic exercises do? So yes, Ryan seems to have discovered the method that works much more reliably and that essentially every other top-level arm wrestler is pursuing. Will it help him out in actual matches? Well, it should, theoretically. But it's very important that even at the top level, you do not negate parts of that pyramid of sports training and keep practicing it at all levels. Otherwise, stagnation will hit at some point. But that's it for today, and I'll see you next time.